So we're here at the London Stock Exchange because you want markets to champion UK defence. My question to you, Secretary of State, is whether the UK government is doing enough to champion defence. You're not going as far and as fast as Germany, for example, and that's where we've really seen the big stock rally for the likes of Rheinmetall. Do you need to go further on public spending on defence?
I want markets to champion defence. I want them to invest in defence, just as we are doing as a government. So we're putting 5 billion extra into defence this year, and we've made the commitment that we'll increase that to 2.5% of what the country produces by 2027. We haven't spent at that level in the UK for 15 years, and we're doing that to respond to the threats that we face. But
we've slipped behind Germany as the second biggest European spender in NATO. The army's at its smallest since the Napoleonic era. Is that 2.5% of GDP on defence by 2027 enough to fix those issues?
Well, you're completely right. We've had 14 years, as one of my predecessors, Ben Wallace, said, of hollowing out and underfunding our armed forces. So we've got a big job to do, not just to meet the threats, to develop the new technologies that give our forces the kit they need for the future. But no, 2.5% is not enough. It's why we've also made the commitment that we'll reach 3% in the next Parliament as well. But for me as Defence Secretary, it isn't just about how much we spend, it's how well we spend it and how we spend it.
So on that point, will the increased spending be ring-fenced for UK companies, or would the UK arm of a US company count, for example?
Well, first of all, the how we spend has got to reflect the threats and what our forces need for the future. So I've made the commitment that, alongside the Chancellor, that 10% of what we spend on equipment this year in defence will be ring-fenced for novel technologies and novel equipments. We've got to put our forces at the cutting edge of technology to give them the edge on the battlefield as well.
But would you agree that the UK defence industry needs to be less reliant on allies like the US?
So when the Prime Minister made the commitment that we would raise defence spending to 2.5% and then to 3% in Parliament, he spoke almost as much about the British economy as he did about national security. And we're a government that recognises defence is an engine for growth. And I'm a Defence Secretary that will direct British defence investment wherever I can to support British-based business, British-based jobs, British-based innovation and British-based technology.
I mean, we can debate the multiplier effect of defence compared to other industries, but just on the point you made about the cutting edge, how are you ensuring that the defence industry here learns from Ukraine and keeps pace with the innovation on the battlefield?
First of all, we're already incorporating the lessons that we have learned in working with Ukraine. The UK is really the country that has led support for Ukraine. So the speed at which we've been able to procure for Ukraine, the way that we've been able to do that, not just fast, but fairly and good value for money, we can do for ourselves now in the future. And that was part of my argument to the investors I spoke to here before I closed the stock market. I want them to invest in defence. I want them to invest in Britain.
Yeah.
And I want them to recognise that investment in British defence is a good investment.
Yeah.
Because you can't have a stable economy,
okay.
You can't have a settled society unless you've got strong national security.
So Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky says he's going to be waiting for Russia's Vladimir Putin in Turkey on Thursday. If Putin doesn't turn up and agree to a ceasefire, are the UK and allies, including the US, ready to hit Russia with massive sanctions?
Yeah, so you saw Keir Starmer in Kyiv with other European leaders at the weekend. Together those leaders were saying, look, Russia has talked about peace, but is not taking the negotiations seriously. It was the very day that Putin was celebrating his victory parade in Moscow, but there is no victory in sight for him in Ukraine. And we're ready to turn up the pressure on Putin, both to bring him to the negotiating table, but also to make sure that we can put Ukraine in the strongest possible position at the negotiating table, just as we are on the battlefield.
But are you sure Trump's ready to turn up the pressure on Putin?
Well, he's talked about wanting to see Putin brought to the table.
With sanctions there.
He's talked about the economic pressure, and we will play our part as European nations. both in doing what we can to put pressure on Putin to negotiate, to put an end to this fighting as he can, but we in the meantime will not forget about the war and jeopardize the peace. So we will keep supporting Ukraine so that it stays as strong as possible on the battlefield.
Well, if the US won't continue providing weapons to Ukraine, does that mean that the UK would buy those weapons from the US and give or lend them to Ukraine?
Do you know one of the interesting things in the last year, more than half of the military support that went into Ukraine was provided by the non-US members of NATO. And so Britain, and led by Britain, European nations are stepping up for Ukraine. We're stepping up on European security, and we're stepping up on defence spending. A challenge that President Trump has issued rightly to us. We're responding, and we will go further.
My question, though, is what happens to those US weapons?
Well, at the moment, we're doing what we can, and Britain has stepped in to convene and chair what's called the Ukraine Contact Group. I chaired that about 6 weeks ago in Brussels. That's nearly 50 nations, not just European nations, committed to continuing to support Ukraine in the battle. And the US has been part of those discussions, part of those meetings. And the challenge for us as non-US NATO nations is to step up the contribution that we make for the future, and we will.
So on that point of European cooperation, is the UK talking to Germany and France and Italy and Spain about common equipment?
Yes. One of the important steps as a new government that on defence and security was for me striking the Trinity House Agreement in October with Germany, the first ever defence agreement between our two nations. It is far-reaching, it's deep, and this week I meet Minister Pistorius to take stock of that, and that is about procurement that we can do together. It's about military exercising we can do together, and it's about meeting the common threats and strengthening the European leadership in NATO together.
There's just a few days until this UK-EU summit. Would you like a clearer steer from the EU that UK companies, the sorts that you're addressing here at the London Stock Exchange, are going to be able to join its defence fund?
Well, we're in the sort of hardest yards of the negotiations. We're a government that even before the election said that the security challenges we face in Europe require the UK and the EU to work closer together. We've been willing and ready to do that. And we've said from the outset that we're ready to strike an agreement if the EU will do so too. So I hope we'll see on Monday what the European Union has now offered as a security and defence partnership struck with the UK. And that is the starting point or the basis on which we can discuss further whether the UK and importantly UK businesses, defence companies that lead the world in some of the technology we produce and the equipment we design, can play a part within the wider European programmes.
Just finally, would Europe ever want the capability to actually project power? Or do you just want to be a deterrent to the likes of Russia?
Oh, I'm very clear, it's NATO that's the cornerstone of our security. It has been for 80 years. NATO is 32 nations strong now, and its power and its purpose is to be strong enough to deter the wars we don't want to fight, but to be strong enough to fight and win those wars if any adversaries challenge us.
And you're convinced that ultimately the US would honour its commitment to NATO?
It's not just whether I'm convinced. President Trump made that commitment in the White House to Keir Starmer when they were there together in the Oval Office. Totally committed to Article 4 and NATO, Article 5, totally committed to Article 5 and NATO, but challenging Britain, challenging other NATO nations to do more of the heavy lifting. Now, we've argued for 4 or 5 years that that's something that Europe must do, that Britain must lead, and that's something now that we're in government, we're starting to do.
But just finally, if we're being frank, Secretary of State, is Europe a safer partner for the UK than the US?
Europe is safer if we've got our 32-nation NATO alliance. The US is a central part of that. And as the Defense Secretary of the US said to me and to the other nations when I pulled them together in that Ukraine contact group, look, our challenge is for Europe to step up, but that does not mean the US stepping away.
Secretary of State John Healey,
Thank you.
Thank you.